Welcome, everyone. This is the second of our panel discussions of the Orinoco Tribune editorial team. We've also got a very special guest with us today from ANTICONQUISTA, which is Victor Coronado. Today, we're going to discuss the conflict in Ukraine that a lot of people have been discussing lately. We're just going to try to go through a few. We have a series of questions we're going to try to get through here today. To those of us that have joined us, thank you very much. Please check out anticonquista.com and check them out on social media for lots of great video content, especially providing socialist and anti-imperialist news from the Latin America. And again, we are orinocotribune.com. You can obviously find us on the internet, on social media, and we thank you for tuning in, and we thank all the people that have supported us over the last 3 years. We're entirely dependent on your funds for our operations, so thank you for your continued support. So let's get right into it. I guess the first topic that will seems the appropriate place to begin is to speak about a bit of the historical background of this conflict in terms of the nationhood of Ukraine, the relation of Ukraine to Russia, the relation of the US and NATO to these nations. And you know, the events not just of the last few months or of the last few years, but of the last 30 years, and even going back well before that. So I guess I would ask, what context of this background is important for one to understand the conflict that's happening right now? Victor, maybe you can let us know what you think about that.
Yeah, sure. So today, the latest that I've seen, I think this was yesterday from, excuse me, Al Jazeera, Pentagon said in a statement that this brings the total, I'm just reading the quote directly from an Al Jazeera source. The Pentagon said in a statement that this brings the total of US military assistance to Ukraine since Russia's invasion began on February 24th to approximately $3.4 billion. And so as far as providing context, historical context, I mean, it's interesting, the question is interesting because when you juxtapose the mainstream coverage compared to reality, right? When you think about that over the last, 8 years or so, approximately 14,000 people in the Donbass region have died due to a conflict that no one really cared about, and so all of a sudden now we're supposed to care about one side of this conflict. That needs to be taken into account. People need to study that very carefully. When we're talking about from Russia's perspective, the fact that they have voiced their concerns for well over a decade, security concerns with regards to NATO expansion. This idea that somehow this is unprovoked, or that this comes out of the nothing, and that Putin is some madman who's lost his mind and is invading a sovereign country, which we can get into the whole thing about whether how sovereign Ukraine is. No, these things don't happen out of the nothing. There's a reason why this happened, and it's important for people to understand NATO, the history of NATO, obviously the history of the U.S. vis-a-vis the former Soviet Union, and now Russia, and so I'll stop there. I'm just kind of giving a high level, because I know we got a long program, and I know others want to chime in, but it's important for people to understand that this did not happen out of the nothing. And even in the U.S. mainstream media, for years was talking about Putin's concerns which again he's voiced over and over and over again, with regards to NATO and NATO expansion. And so, a good comparison that a lot of people have used is that, can you imagine if all of a sudden, Russia had some sort of military alliance in the Latin American region, right? And then started expanding closer and closer towards the U.S. border, right? What would be the U.S. response? Well, we know what the U.S. response would be. So it's important for people to understand these things, understand that this did not happen out of the nothing, and then specifically that Donbass region. I think, it's a shame that again, folks are not being led astray again, about another conflict, and the U.S. media propaganda machine is just selling people a bunch of lies, which again we can get into in the program. But I'll stop there, and I'd like to hear someone else chime in.
Great. I think that really just gives us an idea of how important it is to not just listen to what we're simply hearing in the mainstream media, who obviously they don't even go back to, for example, 2014, let alone going back to anything before that. Khalil, maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on what Victor said.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I mean, just on history in general, I thought the other day I saw the argument being presented that even like a historical analysis was obscuring like our understanding of the situation in Ukraine, as if, like history could get in the way of like any immediate understanding of the situation. And yeah, I think one of the most overlooked facts just in all the post-Soviet countries is just how, yeah, the breakup of the Soviet Union created, I think it's like 25 foreign nationals immediately. And that's just always forgotten. And the other day I saw that, yeah, that, that being criticized, and they were saying that Russia just had this like ambiguous excuse of like ethnic Russians being prosecuted as this war cause that they could invoke at their whim, in their like westward expansion. And yeah, like you said, people, they never go back to 2014, and they definitely don't go back to the 90s or the 80s when trying to get a grasp of the situation. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there because we got a bunch of questions coming up.
Jesus, you've spent some time in the Soviet Union. Maybe you would care to elaborate a little bit on the history of this conflict.
Yes, it's complicated, because it's a long history, and as we wrote down you wrote down, Steve, in the guideline for this activity. I mean, we can go back to the Rus, the time when the Russian nation was created. So if we go back to that time, it's absolutely understandable the speech of Vladimir Putin on February 21st and on February 24th, when he finally decided to announce the military operation against Ukraine. So, I mean, what is important to rescue from that is that, I mean, Russians and Ukrainians are almost the same people. And they are almost the same nation, but for geopolitical reasons, in the last maybe century, the Ukrainian nation has been consolidated itself as a separate entity. But Russians and Ukrainians see themselves as cousins, disregarding all the political bias that you might hear from a Russian up there or an Ukrainian in the other side. So it's complicated because within that understanding is that President Putin decided to launch his military operation, and first of and before that, the recognition of the Donbass, the Lugansk and Donetsk republics, People's Republic. So, I mean, what I wanted to say is that Putin said that he's doing this to prevent, I mean, he initiated the military operation to prevent the disappearance through the Western intentions, because of the Western intentions, the squeezing of Russia, and he went back, and while doing that, he talked about another historical important events like the Soviet Union and how the borders between the 15 Soviet republics that belong to the Soviet Union were created. I mean, and that's an analysis that I know that we are going to discuss later, but that's part of the problem. I mean, basically, Soviet he put the blame on Lenin and Stalin in his national in the approach to the national question, and he basically criticized them for the way they took territories from Russia that belongs historically to Russia, and basically gave it to the new Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So that's part of the analysis that has to be done in order to understand, the big picture behind the whole conflict. Another important aspect that needs to be understood is the one related to World War II and Joseph Bandera and the existence of a big movement of nationalist, fascist, neo-Nazis group in Ukraine that is not new, that does not start with Euromaidan in 2014 or the coup d'etat against Yanukovych in 2004. I mean, it basically goes way beyond that, and the biggest representative figure behind that movement is Joseph Bandera. I believe that I shared with you in a meeting a few weeks ago that when I live in, I had the honor to receive a scholarship in the 80s from the Soviet Union, and I lived 1 year in Volgograd, and I live almost 2 years in Kiev. So when I was there, I was too young. I was like 17 years old. So I was a kid, but the Russians, and I was not aware of a lot of things in history then, but I remember that the Russians and the Ukrainian in Kiev, whenever we were talking about Second World War or Nazi or things like that, the first things that they talk about was Bandera. And at the beginning, I was like, what Bandera have to do with Ukrainian, with Russian? Because I associate the name with the bandera in Spanish. You know what I mean? With the flag. And I was like, what these guys are talking about? I didn't know the history of Ukraine at that moment. So I was like, at the beginning, I was like lost in translation. But then I learned about this guy, which basically represent the west of Ukraine, and always, and when I live in Kiev, there were always this conception that Ukraine was divided in two pieces, the east and the west. And in the east, the capital was Kiev, and in the west, the capital was Lvov. And in the west, the biggest hero was Joseph Bandera, which happens to be ultra-nationalist leader that end up supporting the Nazis entering into Russia, into the Soviet Union, when Hitler decided to initiate the Barbarossa military operation, the invasion, basically, in 1941. So 42, I believe. No, 41. So basically, Bandera was this guy that helped, because of his hatred of the Russians, helped the Nazis to, pass through Ukraine and inflict the big damage that the Nazis inflicted against Russian population. during those years. But at some point, Bandera is being put in a concentration camp, and that's used a lot by those guys replicating the mainstream media saying that there's no Nazism in Ukraine. A lot of those guys say that because Bandera was put in a concentration camp at Nazis. That's a good example that there's no Nazism in Ukraine. I don't know what is how can that fact explain the other? But anyways, I mean, I hear people saying those things when trying to minimize the role of Nazism in current Ukraine. And what is important to add to that story is that when the Nazis were losing the war, we're talking right now about 1944, Bandera was taken out by the Nazis from the camp, from jail, because they wanted him to help them stop the Russian advance, to expel the Nazis from Ukraine. So it's a complicated situation, but I believe that we need to talk a little bit about these issues that to have a better understanding. And it's important to say that the Bandera is a hero. And you see the picture of Bandera behind a lot of Ukrainian mayors and aldermen and even high-ranked officials. So that's crazy, and that's a very clear, evidence that Nazism is there, not among Ukrainians, among high-ranked Ukrainian officials. So I want to stop it there because I talk too much.
Thank you, Jesus. We could obviously go into great depth about this history of Stepan Bandera. It's very important, as well as with his other associates, some of whom were protected from war crimes tribunals by the US, and some of whom, many of whom went on to work directly for the CIA in its anti-Soviet operations beginning after the Iron Curtain speech of 1946 and the declaration of the Cold War. Rob, maybe there was something you'd like to add to this?
So first of all, I appreciate all the comrades pointing to how mainstream liberal media doesn't have the capacity to encapsulate this history, right? It takes a different kind of political ideology to take all these this complicated network of history and to come to a conclusion off of that tapestry. So the mainstream media want to have these kind of like isolated ideas of who Putin is. Like Putin is just like this evil madman, and Putin is Russia, as if Russia isn't its own government with its own democratic institutions, with its own political history and aspirations, right? And as if we don't know NATO, as if we don't know the character of NATO. Everybody here can attest to the character of NATO being like this imperialist projection of power from the West that we lost Libya to, Afghanistan torn to pieces, Iraq, Iran, the list goes on, as if we don't know that nature. So I want to appreciate comrades for that, and appreciate Jesus for laying out the background from World War II. But as I see it, this conflict pretty much had its height in 2014, and we did touch on it a little bit, but I want to paint it as how I see it. So in 2014, there was a Western-backed coup d'etat for the democratically elected president of Ukraine. And we could say what we want about bourgeois democracy, but the point is that they removed this man as a in a way that was not in line with their constitution, at the behest of all these we can call them Western oligarchs. You could see what's that name? John McCain rallying a bunch of nationalists, the nationalist base that had been in development since World War II, as Jesus said. You could see, I think her name is like Victoria Nuland. She has like that tape where she's just like, yeah, that's our guy. She's just selecting the hero for these people. So the fact of the matter is, when Victor talked about sovereignty, is that sovereignty? Is that a sovereign nation? After they got their president hand selected by the West? No. So this was major cause for concern for Russia, because now on its doorstep it has like a Western puppet for the for NATO forces in America to stage realistic military threats at their doorstep. And we're not talking about like existential kind of thing. We're talking missiles that can strike the capital in like less time than they can prepare for. You don't want that. No one in their right mind would allow that on their doorstep. And the mainstream media would have you believe that this just came out the blue. We already discussed. This has been a red line for Russia since before it was Russia. So I just wanted to talk on that. And if I have like the time, I want to say that when you discuss these kind of things, like we know the liberal media is gonna it's the talking head for imperialism. But there here, me being in the United States, there's a lot of people who would smear me as a Putin apologist, that, you know what I'm saying, that, oh, you just putting on for Putin. Like, that's not how I operate, bro. Like, Putin doesn't have anything ideologically to offer me. But when I look at Libya, when I look at what happened to Afghanistan, when I look at what happened to all these countries, bro, and like the people and their infrastructure being dismantled, I don't want that for any country. So I can't be mad at the steps that Russia's taken to prevent that. Me personally, right? And all these purported leftists, they want to be like, oh, how are you going to support like a bourgeois democracy? How are you going to support an imperialist country? Da, 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 da. And it reminds me of this quote from Lenin. If I could share the quote, Stevie, you let me know when to shut the hell up. Lenin said,
share your Lenin quotes.
the socialist of another country cannot expose the bourgeois and the government of a country at war with its own nation. And not only because he does not know the country's language, history, specific features, etc., but also such exposure is part of imperialist intrigue, not internationalist duty. So when I hear that, I think to myself that, wow, these people's analysis, when they come, now they give it, it's like Victor said, now you a Ukraine expert, now you a Russia expert, right? Now that the State Department tells you like, hey, this is a concern, now you're interested in that people's history. Now, so they go backwards, bro. They start from what the imperialists have to say, and that's their conception of the country, right? And then they go from there. We have to understand that those people have their own lineage, their own history that is beyond complicated. You could look at a map from Ukraine and be like, over here, these are the Russians, where the Russians at. Over here, this is like historically Ukraine, and these people have been interacting with each other for thousands of years, you know? So I just wanted to speak to that, how liberals and liberal medias cannot encapsulate the complex web that this conflict embodies. So yeah, that's what I gotta say.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Rob. Feel free to take, as long as you want, everyone. Don't worry, there's no real time limit, especially if you're gonna use your time to quote from Vladimir Lenin. Shahili, maybe we're gonna get on later on. I mean, the topic of this panel is socialists and anti-imperialists perspective on the Ukraine conflict. We're gonna get on later on in the discussion into some more maybe theoretical aspects, but for now we're still just covering the question of what is the context and the background to this conflict that's important to understand and that is often ignored by the mainstream media. Shahili.
Okay, so there is this thing that Khalil mentioned, and also it's common to see in mainstream media, that we should discount history, that we should not talk about it because it takes away from the current conflict. And to that, my answer, coming from a formerly colonized people, is that one has to be either very privileged or very ignorant or both to think that history does not affect us. So I don't know which of these the media people are, maybe one, maybe both. But anyway, in case of Russia Ukraine thing, like Jesus and everybody said, these things go back to the 19th century. The question of Ukraine, the question of Ukrainian nationality. I'm not talking about nationalism, but as nationality. And when we talk about nationality, we also need to mention that in the Soviet Union and also in present day ex-Soviet countries, in each country, there are many nations living together. They should have been living in harmony, but they aren't, because in bourgeois nationalist countries, there is this tendency of homogenization and the homogeneous national identity. So there is something called the Russian chauvinism. Similarly, there is an Ukrainian chauvinism that is not mentioned as much, but it exists there, who think that they're Europeans and try to negate their Asian descent, Asian heritage. The same case exists in Russia, and there are many Russians who would like to think themselves Europeans and discard their Asian heritage as barbaric or something like that. So the mainstream media has, interestingly, referred to this heritage, this Asian heritage, as the reason behind Putin's declaration of this military operation in the Donbass and then later into Ukraine, in a very, like, they call themselves liberal, but this is very racist to think that Asians are barbaric, and hence it is these Asiatic tendencies coming out in this war, in this invasion, conflict, whatever you call it. However, this war, like Ukraine has been at war against people of its own country, like the government has been in war against its own people for 8 years. That mainstream media paints the people of Eastern Ukraine now, like in Donbass and also in other parts, which are not in the republics, but in Donbass region, and would probably like to join, like Mariupol, for example, which is outside of like the Donetsk Republic, but is within the Donetsk province. And I mean, mainstream media tries to paint these people as Russian separatists. But let us remember that these people are not Russian, as in not Russian nationals. They are Ukrainian nationals. They have been, at present, whoever there are, all of them have been born and brought up in Ukraine. And not all of the Russian speakers are of Russian ethnicity. There are other ethnicities also in Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine too, who are speakers of Russian language. As we know, like there are many ethnicities who speak the same language. So that is the case. Like they are not Russian separatists and not even pro-Russian separatists. They are mostly just they were for the last 8 years trying to preserve their identities, their cultures, and even their languages, because there was this ban on the use of Russian as an official language. This is nothing but really what fascism means. This is fascist. This is what Israel does in the territories of Palestine that is occupies, or like in many cases it used to be done, like Rob would be able to say that in once upon a time in Puerto Rico, Spanish was banned. And this same thing is also exists in the Malvinas Islands, where Spanish is banned and English is the official language, although it belongs to Argentina and is occupied, colonized by UK. So this is a very similar way that these people of Eastern Ukraine, these Russian speakers, both ethnic Russians and belonging to other ethnicities, who felt their like themselves threatened. And of course, this is not just about culture. There is also a real war going on. They were being shelled day and night every day. It was more intense in 2014, 15, and then their intensity decreased but never stopped. And recently the intensity increased just before Russia intervened in those regions. So we should take into account that over 14,000 people have died. Many have tried to minimize this thing, and said that no, there is no genocide, or there is no ethnocide, or there is nothing like this existing in Eastern Ukraine, because out of 5 million people, uh, 14,800 is not much, one might say. But it is not just the number of deaths or the people who have died. Many of them have been, like a third of them have been civilians, and the rest, the two-thirds, not all of them were regular soldiers all the time, but had to be so in order to protect their lands. And we should say that their lives matter too. So these people, like 14,800, may not be many out of 5 million, but when a country, when the government of a country, when the authorities of a country kill this number of its own people, it becomes a very uncivil war. And this was what was happening in Ukraine, over the Eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, and also in Odessa and other places for the last 8 years. And I mean, we should take this into account when we discuss what is happening at present.
Thank you, Shahili. Thanks, everyone. We're going to move on to a more speculative question here. And again, I say speculative because here we're just going to, I mean, everyone's talking about this in our real lives. We're wondering, how long is this thing going to go on for? What's going to happen next? Someone predicted to me that Finland was going to get invaded next. The next person thinks that World War III has begun. Some people think that Putin is going to be overthrown. There's going to be a regime change in Russia. There's a lot of speculations about what's going to happen next, how this conflict is going to end, where it's going to get to. So maybe we could speak a little bit about what we think Russia's goals with this special military operation are, what it is that Russia is hoping to achieve. Where is this conflict? Where might it lead to? And again, this is just as part of a geopolitical analysis. It's an educational process to speculate. I switched around the order a little bit here. So Jesus, maybe you can give us your response to this question. Where is this going to go, and what do you think Russia's goals are?
Yes, I believe that the first, direction that one has to point at to answer the question is, again, Putin's speech on February the 21st and February 24th. I mean, if someone wants to understand the Russian vision of this conflict, you have to read or watch Putin's speech on those 2 days. Especially in the one about the beginning of the military operation, the so-called special military operation, that is the one from February the 24th. Putin precisely talk about denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. I believe that those are the main goals for Russians, at least at the beginning. And I believe that even we are almost 2 months from the beginning of the operation. I believe that those goals remain the same until today. That doesn't mean that they might not change, especially because, in the middle of war, anything can happen. And as Steve mentioned, I mean, we can, start to elucubrate. How do you say that in English? Does that word exist in English?
Elaborate?
Yes, maybe elaborate about what might happen, like a possible, invasion of the Russians to Finland or Sweden or Poland, that has been acting very belligerently in this conflict. If you ask me, the first country that I believe that is going to be touched by by Russian military if this conflict escalates is Poland. and that's my opinion, because they have been actively sending weapons, doing training, and they have been almost belligerent in this conflict. But anyway, going back to the question, is like, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that things can change. And that will depend on the other countries surrounding the conflict. That will depend on Washington actions, on NATO actions. So it's complicated, but I believe that is a real goal presented by Putin, the one about denazify Ukraine, which is an important thing that has been tried again. I repeat it because I believe it's important. Has been, Western media, mainstream media has been trying to minimize, to whitewash it, to make it less important of how it is. But the Russians are trying to do that, and the liberation of Mariupol is a good, sign. It's something that happened just a few hours ago, and it's still ongoing, because we still have those Azov battalion fascists in the hide in a hole of the Azovstal steel, plant, but they will eventually surrender, I believe, I hope. But anyway, anything can happen with those crazy guys, and I'm thinking that maybe they can, try to escape or open a tunnel, or attack with the local population. I mean, anything can happen if you are in the middle of a war like the one that is being held right now in Ukraine. So I believe that that's the only thing that I can say. Of course, when we decide to put these questions, this question in the dialogue, we were also talking about the changing reality, and that led us to a discussion that we as an editorial team had a few weeks ago, when the talks in Turkey between the Ukrainians and the Russians happened, and there was a nice sign at that moment that things might going to move fast towards peace, because after those negotiations in Turkey between the Ukrainians and the Russians, I mean, they were clear. I mean, there was a path drawn that shows that maybe a peace agreement was coming soon. But less than 24 or 48 hours later, everything changed. And the Ukrainians and the gringos began with the Bucha massacre scene, and announcing that they were going to send weapons to Ukraine, and that doesn't help if you want to, and also announcing that they didn't want to become, because in that one of the most important things in that draft of peace agreement that was agreed in Turkey was that third countries were going to monitor the evolution of the agreement. And immediately after that, less than 24 hours after that, I believe that the US and some European countries say that they didn't want to do that, that they were not allowed to do that. That they made excuses out of it, but basically they withdraw themselves from that equation. And of course that jeopardized also the peace agreement. So, and when you analyze those things, and this is, I believe that this is important to be highlighted, that you realize that NATO and the US do not want this thing to end. I mean, they do not want it to end. I mean, that they need this, and this is part of their plan. And when you see you connect all the dots, you realize that that's actually true. I mean, that is happening. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. And just going back to the discussion that we had during those days, because one day we were hoping that the peace agreement was about to be signed, and the other day, the situation was completely different is that, I mean, sometimes when we are especially in a website, like a news website like Orinoco Tribune, sometimes we might, publish information based on a particular photograph or of a particular time, but a few minutes later, things might change dramatically. And I mean, part of our work is just take the photograph, and maybe in another publication, in another post, we are going to have to take the photo of the, different development that happened within that, news, that event. So anyway, that's what I wanted to mention about this particular issue.
Thank you, Jesus. Shahili, when do you think this conflict is going to end? How long is it going to last? Where are we going next? What are Russia's goals? Shahili.
Okay, so I think it was I who had hoped that, like, who had believed that the conflict would be ending by the beginning of May, at the time when these negotiations in Turkey were going on. Because yes, the negotiations in Turkey looked like they were going to become fruitful, and that there were compromises from both sides, let's say, because Ukraine had given in writing at that negotiation, the representatives of Ukraine had given in writing that they were going to remain neutral, not going to join NATO. And Russia, as a compromise, said that yes, they could join EU, that Russia has no problem if Ukraine joins the European Union or has some sort of trade agreement with the European Union. Russia has like trade with, or used to have trade with, all European countries until before the conflict started. So if Ukraine wanted to have the same, they did not really have any trouble. They did not even have any trouble if it became part of EU or some other similar trade or even supranational agreement. And that is why I thought that since both sides are compromising, of course, there was not much talk about denazification in that thing, but we thought that, at least I thought that, since both sides were disposed towards compromising on certain points, there would be a peace agreement and and longer negotiations soon, and things will die down by the beginning of May. That was my belief at that time. However, just like Jesus said, they staged the Bucha massacre, and one has to say that it is staged because a lot of evidence would point towards it, and all these things, this Bucha massacre or whatever they are showing of Mariupol, making it another Aleppo, all these are making me think of everything that came out of Syria in mainstream media, especially in 2015-16, and still comes out to a lot lesser extent. But yes, in Syria, the Islamic State and all its offshoots were whitewashed as the nationalists, the one that were defending Syria from its dictator president. They didn't even consider him president, but anyway, from the dictator Bashar al-Assad. And in case of, and even now, there are all these people, even so-called leftists, who claim that it's Russia that's occupying Syria. So these are the same people who think it's Russia that's occupying Ukraine, or that this war was unprovoked and Russia wants to, like Russia is imperialist and wants an imperialist expansion. However, there is also these things that weapons companies, we must mention these, the weapons manufacturers, and like out of top 10, that 7 are US, I think, and there is also Italian and etc. So French. So all these companies want the war to continue so that their profits increase. And in a world that is dominated, like in which imperialist powers are dominated by weapons companies, wars can go on forever. And in this regard, I would like to say that, so those people who are thinking that World War III has begun, etc., I personally believe that World War II never ended, and that all the conflicts that happened, I mean, just after World War II, you start the Cold War, you go into the Korean Peninsula and use biological weapons there. And then you go into other places in many other countries. Like this never stopped. The wars never stopped. And So even at this point, we're talking about Ukraine, but there are more than 40 conflicts going on all over the world. So it is a world war-like situation. So it's not like the World War III needs to begin. It already is there, it's staring us in the face. However, uh, I don't think that the US or any other country is going to send troops into Ukraine, because if that happens, then that will be a point of no return, really. Okay, so there would be mercenaries, there would be weapons. When Biden knows this, that is why he is declaring 800 million in military support, but he is never saying that he would send troops. He even said that he would not send US troops to Ukraine, but there would be mercenaries, and that will be there, and that happens a lot in all conflicts around the world. So I think that this thing can be protracted, unfortunately. And this was something that the Western powers wanted, especially US wanted, NATO wanted, that to drag Russia into a situation, a quagmire, like they had dragged USSR into in Afghanistan in the 80s. And, mm, and even Russians think that it could be a very long thing, especially denazification of Donbas, or the reintegration of Donbas into Russia. And I say reintegration because there are like peoples on both sides think, and they're true, that they are the same people, and that they are families, and that there is a lot of movement on both sides even during the war. So it's they believe that this could be very long. The West wants to break up Russia like it broke up Yugoslavia. That was like the first big socialist country that they broke up. And they would, Russia is not socialist, but it's a very big country, like one of the largest in the world. So they would like to break up Russia into 4 or 5 parts, so that it never remains a threat to the West. Like it's considered a threat to the West, and it never remains a threat to the West. So this is really a sort of existential thing for Russia. And so I believe that it will go like all the way in order to preserve itself.
Thank you. Victor, what about you? Where do you think this is going? What do you think Russia's goals are?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to take Russia's word for it in terms of what their goals are. I mean, their stated goals are neutrality. They want a neutral Ukraine, and they want to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. If we go back to how this thing started, so you had, again, going back to the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk declare themselves to be independent states. Russia immediately acknowledges them, right? And Russia immediately says, we're going to go into these regions to essentially protect them, right? And I think at that moment, Putin was waiting to see what the response was going to be, because at that point, and even still now, you had and you still have an opportunity for a diplomatic solution, a political solution to these problems, right? And instead, what did you get, right? What was the response from the West, and what was the response from Ukrainian President Zelensky? It was a lot of belligerence. It was a lot of warmongering type of rhetoric, and so at that point, Putin said, "Okay, we've had enough of this, and we're going to go ahead and again begin our special military operation." So for me, I believe that I'm going to take Putin's word for it. Those are the stated goals. That's what they're trying to do. And what's interesting is what you don't hear from the West, because you hear a lot of propaganda. Look, conflict is bloody, it's messy, it's not pretty. Like, no one's going to try to paint this out to be like, oh yeah, this is a simple military operation. Or no, it's bloody, it's messy. That being said, I would challenge folks at home to really do your research, and this is where I would say that the capitalist press is not very helpful at all, because they're painting this picture of again, an evil monster dictator Putin who's going in there and eating up children, et cetera, et cetera. And the truth of the matter is that they have been very, in terms of now speaking, from a military perspective, They have been very targeted, and they have been very careful about what areas they're targeting. They've even given warnings to tell people, oh, okay, look, we're going to now go and target this area or target this facility, and giving people an opportunity to either surrender or evacuate, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we've never seen anything like this before. And I'm not a military strategist, but I'm listening to people who know about this stuff. And they will often say, like, we've never seen, I mean, they've been very thorough and very meticulous. Not to say again that there hasn't, you know, look, you have casualties. You have that, you know, the term that the US came up with, collateral damage. You're gonna have, that's happening. So I don't want to mislead people to make it seem like, okay, that it's, you know, innocent people are not dying, and that's happening. But the blame should not be put on President Putin or Russia, as far as I'm concerned. The majority of the blame should be put on Washington, on NATO, and you know, the former colonial powers, because there was always, and there still is, a political solution to these problems. Here's, I just got this from my feeds here. This is from Fox News, headline from less than 20 minutes ago. Zelensky warns Russia will likely invade other countries if successful in Ukraine. And then before that, Zelensky, this war can only be stopped by the person who started it, right? And then from Sputnik News, I got this other feed. If you can give me 2 seconds here.
No problem.
Kiev may fake Russian strike on Ukrainian naval base to destroy Odessa cold storage complex. That's from Sputnik. And we've seen that playbook before, right? Where we've seen, you know, we've seen the, you know, when the West started accusing Syria of using chemical weapons and whatnot, you know, my initial reaction was like, okay, where's the evidence for this? Because I didn't see, no one presented it, right? And so, you know, these type of operations, these type of things, you're going to see more and more. And so, you know, going back to your question of where I think this is going to go, look, worst case scenario, can you have a World War III? Absolutely, that could happen. Your best case scenario, and I've stated this from the beginning, is that there's a political diplomatic solution to these problems. And the United States continues to fund the war that the Ukrainians cannot win. This is a losing war. The Ukrainian military cannot defeat the Russian military. Those are facts. That's not that you don't have to take my word for it. You could listen to anybody who knows, who specializes in this stuff, who has a military background, and is credible. All right, let me add that part. And they will tell you the same thing. This is a war that the Ukrainians cannot win. So instead of, and obviously, you know, Sally said, look, the United States and NATO, they're not gonna get really involved. They'll send you money, and they'll do some backdoor channel stuff, and they'll do stuff with the media, but they're not gonna send military troops. So here are the Ukrainians fighting a war they cannot win. And at the end of the day, innocent people are dying. And so your best case scenario is for the Ukrainian president to dialogue and find a political solution. And it's not very complicated. It's not very complicated. The main issue is neutrality. If you get that on the table, right? That's a huge win, right? And then, you know, the other stuff about the denazification, look, we really haven't got into that part, but just a little, we got into it a little bit. But there's this other notion that the West is now painting, even though you can go back just a few years ago and look at the same capitalist press talking about the Nazi influence in the military, in the government. You know, anybody who understands politics knows that, look, there are certain groups within any sovereign nation who are going to wield a certain amount of political power. And there, not only did they have political power, they had, you know, what's the term I'm looking at? These were essentially, ¿cómo que se llama eso, Jesus? Paramilitary, basically, you know, groups out there. You know, I mean, killing people, slaughtering people left and right. And so this idea that there's not this big Nazi influence, and I mean, I mean, we could do a whole program just on that, about how, you know, how these neo-fascist Nazis in Ukraine have also led us to this point. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, it seems over and over again that it is this influence that is perhaps prolonging the conflict. we can continue speculating a little more about where this might end and what Russia's goals might be. Rob, what do you think about this?
I came on, I read this question, I'm like, dang, I'm gonna be like the cynical one because I really don't see an end to this. I really see like an escalation, but I'm glad that we're all in agreement that I can't imagine NATO being like, all right, guys, you win. I can't imagine Russia being like, okay, you can have some Nazis. So it's only gonna escalate from there. I think that when we talk about Russia's goals, right, like just dealing with politicians, you know what I mean? Like, not that like Putin is anything special, just politicians in general, they have to have like a kind of rhetoric, right? So my idea with that whole denazification thing is that I think it's like powerful rhetoric, but I don't know if that's their goal per se. I think that the Russian people champion the defeat of the Nazis. And that's something they should be very proud of. You know what I'm saying? So I do think that there's that aspect there, and that they should carry on, that they're trying to carry on that legacy by taking out this this like Raytheon Nazi puppet state that's on their door. So what I want to get into beyond like these kind of ideas is like, what is the material interest of Russia having a neighbor that isn't bloodthirsty, belligerent on their doorstep? You feel me? Russia had plans to trade gas with Germany. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I forgot what that pipeline's called.
Nord Stream.
The Nord Stream pipeline. And that was like an agreement between two sovereign governments. Everything's cool. And then this happened, and all of a sudden they got to fall in line. You know what I'm saying? So Russia taking a stand in that, it's in its material interest so it can pursue its own life, like to provide for its people, to be a capable state, right? I do want to speak to some of the things that Victor was talking about. And yeah, like when you look at this kind of military operation, when it first happened, I was in awe, bro. My phone was jumping. They were like, Russia takes Ukraine. Russia takes out tactical armaments. Russia holds down like this building, right? And it was a very tactical operation through and through. Like this whole thing, like the way when you see even in the bourgeois media, they can't hide this shit. When like they like encircle their targets. They don't just go in and just blow everything up like in like let's say Iran, where it's just like a people like mowing down whole countries. No, they're not doing that. And they letting people out. When you see like Nazis in like a wig and a dress or whatever trying to hide, it's because the Russians are carrying out that checkpoint and letting people out. The Russians are not destroying like trains to let people out. The Russians are not destroying airports to let people out, which is something I'm glad we mentioned, because, and we all know that we always gotta like start these kind of questions with like I'm not pro-war. Like obviously I'm not pro-war, but I peep how tactical they are, how strategic they are, and minimizing the loss of life. You know what I'm saying? Keeping in mind that the NATO aggression drove them to this point. So yeah, I do think that it comes to the rest of the world, low-key, how like the UN, they had like all these countries come out to condemn Russia, but then like the ones who didn't condemn them, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like China, India, Cuba, Venezuela, things like that. So these countries who think that America is on their side, these countries that Ukraine was an ally of America, look what they did to their president. They need to get right and understand that America is this belligerent imperialist entity, that there has to be a counter to that, and these countries have to build a counter to that if we're going to see a viable end to this. I hope that this makes sense. I'm just saying that NATO ain't gonna stop. Russia ain't gonna stop. The rest of the world has to decide like, yo, that's enough. You can't just overthrow governments anymore like you want, NATO. Those days are over, you know? That's what I think needs to happen.
Thanks so
Okay,
much.
so if you would like, if I can make a very small comment on this about the
Please.
denazification thing. Well, it seems like a rhetoric, and of course, it's a very big thing. Like, what does one imagine when one say the word denazification? Like, didn't the World War II denazify a large part of the world? It did. Anyway, so when we're talking about that, when one say that the Russian people are proud of this history of denazifying a large part of the population, or defeating Nazis during World War II, yes, it was not just Russian people. It's actually a Soviet legacy of defeating the Nazis, and there were many Ukrainians in that too. Like there were, just like there are the Banderites who collaborated with the Nazi collaborators who let the Nazis enter into the Soviet Union. Similarly, there were many people in Ukraine who fought against the Nazis and they were the patriots and fought against the Nazis. So if you look at the World War II casualties, although it was Russia that lost more number of people, it was Ukraine that lost more people compared to its population. Like more percentage of its population was lost in that World War II, which they called which they called a patriotic war. So it was like they were trying to save themselves, like their countries, from the onslaught of Nazis, and a system that would be like that, a fascist world system. So when we discuss this legacy, we should also talk about Ukrainians who are also anti-fascist. And in this regard, we had, at least I had the opportunity to speak to a Ukrainian communist who made this comment. He said, how do you think denazification works out? Do you think it's like painting posters and holding conferences? No, it will be a bloody mess. It will be war. And he talked of his parents and grandparents, who the grandparents were Soviet people who had fought against the Nazis. And he said that his town, like after the World War II, like after at least Russia or like Soviet Union had defeated the Nazis, there were only 4 or 5 buildings standing in his town, and those were also not untouched. I mean, they were just standing as structures. Like all of his town was rubble raised to the ground. It was because like this was the intensity of the fight against the Nazis. And he says that it will be a bloody mess, and we know that most people in Ukraine would like to be like to live in peace, like most people of the world. And there are many who do not really care about who is going to be in power. However, when facing an existential threat like fascism, even people who would otherwise not care would like to have that sort of scourge out of their countries. So yes, there are Ukrainians also who would like to see an end to the Nazism and then live in peace. So let's hope that this like it does not come to whole cities razed to the ground. Of course, I hope it would never happen, because like Russia is not attacking civilian targets or trying not to attack civilian targets. On the other hand, it's these Nazis who are using people as human shields so that there will be casualties, there will be civilian casualties, and then they can show these people and says, look, Russia is so bad, it's killing our children, it's killing our elderly, our women, etc. And this is something very similar that also happened in Syria. They like it was this ISIS who killed or who would hold up people or force people to remain in places that were dangerous, and then when that parts would blow up or when that would be targeted by either the Syrian army or the Russian one, I would say this is so bad, Assad is a dictator, Russia is colonist, etc. So it's very similar what is happening in Ukraine now. And this portion, the portion that these Ukrainian Nazis are using these people, like using people as cannon fodder, is getting lost in all the shoutings of Russia imperialist in the mainstream media. So we would have to like keep an eye on that too and try to make it as widely known as possible. That's what I would like to say. That's all.
Let me add something, Steve. I know that we are running out of time. Can I?
Sure.
Yes, I just want to add like 3 or 4 things. How this will end. I believe that we already, I mean, there's without saying it, there's an agreement that as far as we see it right now, this is not looking like it's going to end soon. And if you ask me, I believe that it's going to be like a guerra de desgaste, we say it in Spanish, exhausting war or something like that, maybe in English. So I really that's how I see it. But we have to put in context that in recent days there has been this initiative from the United Nations, by the Secretary General of the United Nations, that has been initiating talks between Ukraine and Russia, and let's see if that goes anywhere. I don't have too much expectations about United Nations because they are also basically US, puppets. But anyway, let's see what happens. I hope that maybe something good might come out of there. And also about the Nazification, just going back to what Sahili just said, I agree with her in terms of it's a complicated issue, and also what Rob says. I mean, how do you eat denazification? I mean, it's like, wow, how do you do that? But the Russians have history on that, as Sahili also said, and it might mean it's going to be bloody, maybe, but also it's going to be like a process of re-education. I mean, I remember when I lived in Russia, a friend of mine from Peru, he drew himself a swastika here or here, and that guy was about to be expelled of the Soviet Union. Yes, because that stupid teenager, thing. So what I'm trying to tell you with this is that you can institutionalize anti-Nazi policies in a country. You know what I mean? So that and that's the opposite of what you see in Ukraine right now. I mean, if you go outside of your house in Lvov with an swastika, they might give you a medal. You know what I'm trying to say here? I mean, basically, that's how I see in my head how you can eat denazification. I mean, first get rid of the most radical Nazis, and then initiate a re-education process or something like that to try to make that country a little bit less Nazified, or at least in the high, in the top, of official levels or things like that. And also, I wanted to add about the Russian professional military that Sahili was mentioning. Not with those words, but basically about how the Ukrainian use human shields. People, I mean, civil population has human shields, and immediately when she said that, I compared that to Russia's military clear record of professionalism. You know what I mean? I mean, the mainstream media has been trying to let us believe that Russian army is an army of monsters or something like that. And it's the opposite. It's actually the opposite. I mean, it's...
Sorry, Jesus. I'm gonna cut you off, and we're gonna come right back to you in a second.
Okay.
Just we're really we have 3 questions to get through here, and we've already gone about an hour and 15 minutes.
Okay.
Today we're discussing socialist and anti-imperialist implications of the Ukraine conflict. Let's talk a little bit about the international implications for this conflict, particularly the economic aspects that everyone in the, I think across the world is familiar with. We've seen all sorts of sanctions levied against Russia. We've seen in countries of the imperial core inflation. We've seen across Europe protests already in response to that. For socialists and anti-imperialists, this is particularly important because Russia, as we know, has been an ally to certain socialist countries and anti-imperialist countries like Iran, as well as China, as well as Nicaragua, for example. And another one of great importance to us is Venezuela, whom Russia has helped over the last few years of difficult economic times in Venezuela. So perhaps each of us can speak a little bit about what will be the long-term economic implications of what pretty much everyone seems to believe is probably going to be a protracted conflict. And Jesus, maybe you can start speaking again about Venezuela, since we are at Orinoco Tribune, a Venezuela-based news outlet.
Yes, yes. In that particular case, I believe that it's important. I believe that each one of us should talk a little bit about the implications in the particular region where we live. In my case, of course, I'm in Venezuela, so I'm going to mention that because of natural resources, especially oil, we immediately notice the impact of the Ukrainian conflict when a top US delegation came to Caracas unannounced to discuss oil issues with President Maduro that they do not recognize. They do still now do not recognize as the legitimate government president of Venezuela, but they sit with him a few weeks ago when the Ukrainian conflict began. So that's an immediate implication. I mean, there are some talks about the possibility of lifting sanctions. I really don't see it right now. I mean, I don't see that that might happen, especially because the nature of US European sanctions against Venezuela are very complex, very deep already. So I don't see an easy way out for the gringos, not for us, for the gringos, for that maze they have created. But I also want to mention that some friend of us, some leftist friend of ours, believe that Maduro should not sit in the same table with the gringos and negotiate a possible lifting of sanctions. And I want to let those friends that Maduro is not the head of a small political party in the east of Caracas or in the west of Caracas. I mean, he's a head of state. And as head of state, sometimes you need to do pragmatic things in order to keep your population. We're talking here about Venezuela's population that is bigger than 30 million souls, to be better, to do not suffer. So if there's a chance of a lifting of sanctions, I'm sure that Maduro is going to be there trying to look for sovereign ways to do that. And, you know, asking the gringos and the Europeans to respect our sovereignty and to reverse all the mess that they have created themselves with these sanctions. So that's the first thing that I wanted to mention in relation to the sanctions. Maduro announced a few days ago anti-boomerang plan, which is basically a response to the unexpected, unforeseen effects of US and European sanctions in world economy. So, so in that sense, he talked when he made that announcement about you know, increasing production and taking other measures in order to try to minimize the effects of what we already know is happening around the world, which is an increase of prices in energy or in agriculture products and things like that, with the implication that those things have in the rest of the prices in all the economies. So those things are happening everywhere. In Latin America, for example, that's already a fact. I mean, last month, it was evident that most Latin American countries have unexpected hikes in inflation numbers all over the region. Venezuela, I believe, is the only country that is behaving in an opposite direction, but because we are coming from a terrible nightmare of hyperinflation. But even in that circumstances, we reported 1.4 inflation in March, which is pretty good in comparison with the inflation behavior or performance of other countries in the region. So those things might affect us. I mentioned in a piece that we wrote a few weeks ago about inflation also that we have noticed in Venezuela a spike in prices that might have not been reflected in the inflation numbers for March, but I believe that maybe in April we're going to see that. But also I want to mention that in recent days, I've seen that the prices has been going back to normal here in Venezuela. Just for you to know that spike of prices that I mentioned by the end of April has been getting better in recent weeks, in the last 2 weeks or so. So I wanted to mention the inflation as something that is going to affect us. Economic growth, of course, might affect us, but in the case of Venezuela, because we went into a big hole of economic recession because of sanctions and because of the economic crisis that we start feeling since 2014, 2015. We are recovering, and the expectations is that we might have like a GDP increase of like 15% or 20%, according to the Credit Suisse, which is a big, bank from Switzerland. And another thing that not too many people talk about is migration. And migration might be something that because of this crisis created by the Ukrainian crisis, Ukrainian conflict. I mean, I believe that the numbers of migrants going to the U.S. are going to spike, are going to move up, and that will add more fuego, more leña. I don't know how to say that in English. More fire, more fuel to the already burning situation of migrants in the U.S. So that's something that we need to pay attention to. And to add, to the migrants coming from the south to the U.S. through Mexico, you have to add also the migrants coming from Ukraine, which for some reason I was listening to a Reuters report that says that only, it was reported like a week ago that only 2 Ukrainians were granted asylum. Didn't you read that? I saw it in Reuters like a week ago, and I was like, "What? How can that be possible? If mainstream media has been reporting already that there are a bunch of Ukrainians in Mexico waiting to cross the border." So anyway, I just wanted to mention those things. So that's basically what I see is happening in this part of the world in Venezuela. So I'm gonna leave it to there.
Great, thank you, Jesus. Victor, thanks again for joining us from anticonquista.com. Maybe you can comment a little bit on what you think the international implications for this war might be, maybe particularly for those living in the imperial core in the US and for those in Latin American countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're talking about the 5,000 Ukrainian refugees that...
No, I'm talking about that only 2 were granted asylums until last week. Only 2 guys, 2 Ukrainians were granted asylum. I've been reading, as you say, I mean, that about several thousands of Ukrainians waiting in the border of Mexico to cross through San Diego to the US. But a few days ago, I believe that a week ago, I read something about like that, something from Reuters, if I remember well, saying that only 2 Ukrainians were granted asylum, which is weird.
Gotcha. No, I'm pointing to something I posted 4 days ago from Washington Post. 5,000 Ukrainian refugees have arrived in the United States since Russian invasion began. Biden administration says. So I don't know if that's
maybe that I'm gonna Google around to see if maybe I got confused with something.
Yeah.
But
Now that it just says refuge. Now again, how I'm presuming they had to go through some sort of process. They came from somewhere to be given, right? So, anyways, but back to the question. So what's interesting about this question is, so if we pretend for a second that this conflict is not happening right now, that the special operation is not happening right now, economists worldwide were already predicting worldwide inflation, right? Because of COVID and everything like that. So now you have this.
Sorry, Victor, it's 12. I found the piece. 12 Ukrainians
were given official assignment.
Yeah, why did the United States resettle only 12 Ukrainian refugees in March? This is a piece from Reuters from April 11. I'm sharing you.
I'm about to send it to me. So yeah, yes. so so given that backdrop, now you have this situation, and this is from, let me read something from the World Economic Forum, March 18th. So this was about a month ago, because obviously we're seeing prices increase in raw materials and commodities and food prices, et cetera. And as far as Russia is concerned, you know, crude oil is Russia's, again, going back to this piece on over here, World Economic Forum, crude oil is Russia's biggest export, accounting for $123 billion of its export revenues. Data for 2019 shows. And I'm gonna just quickly run off some of the other raw materials and commodities that they export. Petroleum, hovering around over $66 billion. Let's see here. Wheat, 8 point something billion. Iron, other energy and raw materials like cobalt, gold, lead. So I mean, this is a problem, right? This is a major problem, and now a country, you know, and even countries like you know, I'm in Jersey, I'm in the United States, even we're feeling it, right? So I looked up, you know, food prices compared to a year ago in my state. They've increased from over a year ago, and last year they were pretty expensive. Gas prices are hovering about $4 and change right now. And again, that's up over close to $2 from last year. So yeah, so we're feeling the impact. It's not a good time. The liberals are spinning this and pretty much saying to us, you know, the American population, like, you know, this, you know, we have to sort of, you know, this is our way of contributing or something like that, or, you know, I mean, I've heard all types of weird spin in the media of how, you know, and even some, you know, guys that I grew up with and stuff like that I talk to, and now they're in the military or they're this and that, and they're liberals, and I'm talking to them and they're like, yeah, you know, so this is, you know, this, it's either that or we invade, or we do this or we do, so they somehow rationalize this and justify this, when again, I go back to my point earlier that there's a political solution to these problems where no one has to suffer, right? But from the third worldist perspective, I will say that I'm seeing some very interesting things and conversations being had by, you know, by Russia and China and other countries of trying to, how do, you know, some of the conversations about creating different financial models, different trade models, different overall, just different economic models. I think there's an opportunity here for the anti-imperialist, if you want to call it a bloc or movement that you're seeing, you know, this multipolar world. That's a popular term that's being used, and I like the term. So this idea of you know, some of these revolutionary or socialist or progressive governments in Latin America, along with Iran, China, and Russia, trying to figure this stuff out as they go along, right? As you know, as they go along through this process, and saying, okay, how do we go around? Because at this point, Washington is just saying we're just going to sanction everybody. I mean, when you look at how many countries are under sanctions, it's like their position is almost like we're just going to sanction everybody, and except you don't. Again, it's the former colonial powers too, right? It's the EU with the United States and Washington. You know, you don't see the United States saying we're going to go ahead and sanction France or Canada or, you know, another former colonial power. You know, these gringos in Washington. It's a combine. It's a complex. And the rest of the world, this anti-imperialist or multipolar world that's being created, it's saying, how do we get around this stuff? And the challenge for a place like Latin America specifically is, you know, at some point we're going to have to increase productive forces and get creative, you know, and you know, some of the stuff you're seeing out in Nicaragua, and now you're seeing some interesting things in Venezuela, where I think we can look towards different economic models and ways of how to partner up with and this will lead to our I think it's either the next question or the final question. I think it's the next question.
Sorry to interrupt, Victor. Maybe
Yeah,
you can
we're
tell us
limited
a
on
little
time. I'll
more.
stop there. Yeah, you're right. Go ahead.
Maybe you can tell us actually a little more specifically about Nicaragua's response.
Well, so Nicaragua is interesting because they put a lot of focus and energy into food sovereignty. Okay, that's important. When you can feed your own people, when you can be self-sufficient and you don't have to rely on imports to feed your own people. And now, now you have this situation in Russia with Ukraine. How much is Nicaragua going to be affected by this? Probably not too much. I'm not saying they're not going to be affected, but not as much as other places who don't have food sovereignty. So that's just one small example. I mean, we can also talk about some of the indigenous autonomous regions and whatnot. But this idea of feeding your own people, of becoming more self-sufficient, again, and I would challenge, if anybody's listening, for Latin America, we need to increase our productive forces, much like China has. So I'll end there, but those are some of my thoughts.
Thanks so much. I believe I had read somewhere, if I'm not mistaken, that the Nicaraguan government had helped to intervene to cover the costs, the rising costs of fuel, also basically to ensure that the prices at the pump were stabilized for consumers, if I'm not mistaken. Rob, maybe you can continue and tell us a little bit what you think the international implications of the Ukraine conflict might be or already are.
So when I think about these things, I want to be like grounded and not like alarmist or anything like that. But it has to be said that I'm in the imperial heart. Like we're gonna feel the ramifications of this one way or another, and we already feel it economically. From what I'm hearing is that it's only going to be felt more economically. And I'm not necessarily familiar with all the intricacies of like how we already traded with Russia, how the like alliances with other countries that Russia's messing with, you know what I'm saying? Like how that is gonna affect us economically in a specific way. I can only tell that it's going to affect us economically negatively. But I say all that to say that there's already a politically volatile situation in America. Understanding that like 2021 or 2020, there was like mass uprisings around that time, you know what I'm saying, in terms of like police brutality and all this racialized tension. And that kind of quelled because of COVID, because of like, I would say because of COVID. But that's already fading. People are already trying to move past that. And I think that this global situation can only exacerbate what's already happening in the United States. So that's how I see it. Things are already volatile from just the elements on the ground. And I can only imagine this, especially like when you see like Ukrainian Nazis being like allowed this platform, like there's a real right-wing crazy base in America, and it's real. So I imagine that those elements will be emboldened. And then at the same time, we as the anti-imperialists can also up the contradiction of how these refugees are being treated differently than your own refugees, the Haitians, you know what I'm saying? Honduras and things like that. So these tensions are just gonna rise. And I would say that it would only, like you said, fuel the fire.
Thanks, Shahili. You are based in West Bengal. Maybe you can speak a bit about the implications of this war for the global South and for India.
Yeah, so I would like to talk about like not just India, but like on entirety of South Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and Africa in general. Because if you look at the maps, if you just think of the past 20 years, much of these parts have been devastated by the US and NATO and allies in the past 20 years, starting from the invasion of Afghanistan and continuing from there until today. So these regions In fact, they were devastated even before that, since when they tried to or were obtaining national liberation, like this independence. And since then, there has been Western, not just Western backed, it is direct Western intervention in these parts of the world. So already before this Ukraine conflict, or already before even COVID, the situation of inflation, the situation of economy, or even the situation of availability of food in general in these parts were dire. Okay, so we have at this moment the worst humanitarian crisis in since 20th century, let's say, unfolding in Yemen, and nobody is talking about it. Like two-thirds of the population is does not get enough food. And this situation was not created by the Ukraine conflict, but this was created by the Saudi-led, US-backed destruction or invasion of Yemen. Similar is the case of Iraq, or let's say Iran, which until Russia was sanctioned so much, it was the most sanctioned country in the world. And then there is Syria, which has been devastated by a 11-year and continuing war. And even now, there are the sanctions again imposed by US, Canada, European Union. Once upon a time, it was like these parts where once upon a time large wheat producers as well as producers of different kinds of fruits. Now most of that is damaged. So people in these parts of the world were already not being able to get enough food. So you must have heard that in Middle East and North Africa there is a crisis, a crisis or shortage in the availability of wheat, which is the staple food there in those parts of the world. And after that, though their own agricultures were damaged by these imperialist wars, they imported this wheat and other stuff from Russia and Ukraine. Like Russia and Ukraine together constitute 40% of world's wheat export. So with these two countries locked in a conflict, there is like very real possibility that these exports will be cut off, and they're already happening. It's not because these countries are refusing to sell, but because there are all these sanctions on Russia. Like there is 5,200 sanctions, I think, on Russia by now. So and we know that US sanctions work extraterritorially, so they will not only affect Russian entities or Russian people, but they will also affect other people. So shipping companies that transport the grains and like sunflower oil, soybean, oats, rye, barley, mm, and many other kinds of fruits also, like from the southern parts, and also like Turkmenistan and etc. They used the Russian ports to transport these things because they are landlocked countries. So these shipping companies will be afraid to transport these food items from Russia to the Middle East or North Africa. So and it is this reason that there is this rise in the shortage, or there is this so much broad shortages in these parts of the world. Now, when it comes to India or China, these countries are net exporters. Like they are producers of food and net exporters of food. So the crisis in Ukraine is not affecting the food availability. Not like there is not much difference from before. And after, like these countries have been exporting rice and other stuff for a very long time. So this is not affecting these parts directly. But what is happening is that um, when Victor talked about this multipolar world, a multipolar world would not necessarily be an anti-imperialist one. And I'm saying it because, for example, India, it has not supported the sanctions on Russia. It has like abstained on all votes against Russia and such, not because it is an anti-imperialist nation. Like the government of India is actually quite aligned with the US. It took like it's uh, put India into a military alliance, the Quad, with the US, which is against the constitution of India. India is supposed to be neutral and not get into any military alliances unless it is the UN peace course, which is a very different thing. So it is that this government reverted all its his own constitution in order to be able to go into alliance with the US. However, it did not support the US position on Russia out of necessity, because not only is India an importer of oil, because India does not have oil, it is also an importer of technology from Russia. So there are many countries that would not support the Western position of Russia, not because they are anti-imperialist. I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the governments. I'll come to which why. Anyway, so but because of necessities, and in this regard I say governments, because there is this comment which was made to me by an Argentinian friend, who said that the representations in the international bodies like in the UN and all its other instances, as well as IMF, etc., these representations of nations are not elected by the people but are nominated by governments. And in most cases, these people do not come from social movements, nor do they come from political movements, but they are bureaucrats. And when they are voting at the UN or other places, we know that, of course, we know that foreign policy comes from the head of state of that country. But in most cases, these bureaucrats, when they're voting, they would vote first and tell them, like, there would be other bureaucrats who try to convince the government that the way they are voting is correct, or the way they are voting is beneficial for the nation. So it's not like the people and the government are all on the same level when they are voting at the international instances. Anyway, so that's a political portion. If we come to the economic part, yes, there is inflation in like all over South Asia, and I always mention Middle East and Africa, but the inflation there already existed because of wars there. In case of South Asia, there is inflation. There was Sri Lanka, like it is still in a very messy situation. There was a overthrow of a government in Pakistan, and I mean, it was regime change in Pakistan, and there were protests again, rising food prices in Bangladesh, in Thailand, and in many other places. And but most of these do not really come directly from the Ukraine crisis. I don't think that the Ukraine crisis is already affecting these places, but these are all the leftover stuff from COVID, and Ukraine crisis just getting added to it. So in case of South Asia, I would have to wait a bit more in order to comment how the Ukraine crisis is affecting, because most of these countries are producers of food, as opposed to Middle East or North Africa, which are also devastated by war and were importing stuff. So yes, there is a food crisis coming up, not looming, it's already happening in Middle East and Africa, but not in South Asia. Like, it's not much different from before, I'd say.
Thanks, everyone. Again, we're gathered here today to discuss socialist and anti-imperialist response to the Ukraine conflict. We're going to get now a little bit into more questions that socialists and anti-imperialists have been debating. We all know that Vladimir Putin was the right-hand man of Boris Yeltsin when the USSR was dismantled. We know that Russia is not a communist country. A lot of people have been debating what this means. Is Russia an anti-communist nation? Is Russia an imperialist nation, an anti-imperialist, and so on? We also know, as we discussed earlier, that they have been aligned and allied with various socialist countries. How does this conflict, how are we supposed to react? How are Marxist-Leninists, socialists, anti-imperialists supposed to react, and why? Most importantly, and why? In Putin's February 21st speech, which is when he recognized the independence of the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, he described the country of Ukraine as Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine, and he spoke disparagingly of the USSR and Stalin's policies regarding the national question. Putin then promised that Russia would decommunize Ukraine properly. How are leftists, socialists, and the communists supposed to react to comments like these? Victor, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I've seen some very interesting takes on this. I'm going to just say a few things. One, I myself am a communist. I'm a communist, I'm an atheist, and let me just say that while physically I'm in the United States, and I'm an atheist, but spiritually I feel like I'm in I feel more Latin American, if you will, than American, North American, if that makes sense. So my answer to this question is the following, because I think people conflate certain things and confuse certain things. No one's confused about who Putin is and what Russia is. I don't think we're confused about that. With that, so that's not up for debate. We're very clear about that. That being said, that's an internal question for the Russians to decide. Russia is a sovereign nation. From someone who follows Latin American contemporary history and history, we have suffered from this plague of imperialism and colonialism, of people constantly telling us what to do or invading us or overthrowing our governments, et cetera, et cetera. Every country, every respective country, every sovereign country has its own internal contradictions and problems that they must resolve on their own without any external influence or meddling. Okay, so we're clear. So let's be clear. We know who Putin is. We know what Russia is economically, internally, right? It's not a socialist project, economic model, or anything like that. They have their own thing going on in Russia, and that's their own thing. And Putin is their undisputed leader. And whatever contradictions that the Russians have in that country, they must resolve those issues on their own. Me sitting over here in Jersey, Jesus in Caracas, you folks, wherever you're at now, at home or the rest of the panel, we can't resolve Russia's internal problems and contradictions. That's for the Russians to decide. Now, as far as, why, I think Rob was speaking about this, people have called us, Putin apologists, or we're defending Putin or his actions or whatever. Again, that's a very nuanced situation over there. And the other thing that you must consider, and I consider, is that who are my friends and who are my enemies? Let's be clear about these things. Washington is no friend of Latin America. It has never been a friend of Latin America. We are open to the idea of being friends, as Jesus talked about. Maduro should meet with people in Washington. They should. Fidel Castro has always publicly said, we want normalized relations with the United States. They have had back channels with the United States in terms of military and intelligence. And that's on record. Now we know that, right? So this idea that we don't want to be friendly towards Washington, we would love to be friends, I don't want to say love, but we would like the idea of being friends with Washington for practical reasons. But from the Latin American perspective, Putin has been a great friend to us, and Washington has not, okay? We have to be very clear about those things. So from my perspective, from the perspective of Maduro, from President Maduro in Venezuela, or Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, or Nicaraguan President Ortega, so on and so forth. Russia they have never threatened us. They have not put a finger gun or actual gun to our head. They have not tried to invade us. They want friendly relations with us. And we would like to have friendly relations with them, just like how we want to have friendly relations with any other nation, including the United States. So I'm going to just be as succinct as possible in saying that though whatever issues that they're having politically in Russia must be resolved by Russians, okay? And from the socialist Latin American perspective, we greet President Putin with open arms, and we hug him and embrace him because he has been a great friend to us. End of story. So, and I'll let someone else now check.
Great, thank you. Very to the point. We are discussing Putin's purportedly anti-communist statements on February 21st and how this might relate to socialists' perspective on the Ukraine conflict. Rob, what are your thoughts on this?
With the speech, I was watching that speech like it was sports, bro. I was like, so enthralled in what he had to say. But yeah, there were disparaging comments made about Lenin, disparaging comments made about Stalin, like that fall in line with this kind of like idea of like this like brutal dictator and things of that nature. But this is, when I think of that, first of all, if you're a communist, you're not supposed to just be like, you're a communist because you like this person. You're a communist because you like this person. You want to build a more equitable world, or you want to build a world without oppression. So this is a man who experienced his life, who gave his life to the KGB, who was in the Communist Party, and then seen it all collapse, right? So it seems natural to me that he might have criticisms of Lenin, that he has criticisms of Stalin. That doesn't mean that like I share those criticisms, or that it's a whole on condemnation of the communist project as a whole. I seen this quote from Putin that said that he thinks that communism is far off and lofty and not in line with the mainstream political arena, right? And to me, that makes sense. It's something worth striving for. I think so. But Putin is the way I see him is not necessarily like a rabid anti-communist. I see him as a Russian nationalist whose interest is in the security of his nation, right? Me, I'm a socialist, I'm a communist, and I understand that I can't build socialism, I can't build communism out of rubble, out of a destroyed country. You need a country to practice socialism in, right? And I think that imperialism has been the main bulwark against building socialist projects, right? So when I see that that like communists who are like, oh, he's not a socialist government, he's not a socialist, I find that to be infantile, because we got to build socialism by what we have, not what we wish we had. So what I know that we need is a world where this one country of oligarchs can't just come in and destroy your country. And if Putin and his Russian nationalism aligns with that goal and can help that world, I think as socialists, we should recognize that benefit and uphold the right to national sovereignty, regardless of like how they want to, like Comrade Victor said, how they want to run that government. You feel me? To the extent that they oppose imperialism. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, I'm down to chop it up.
Of course. Most of us know that the Communist Party remains in the Russian parliament as I believe the second largest party there. Nevertheless, in Putin's February 21st speech, he described Ukraine as Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine and spoke disparagingly of the USSR and Stalin. Shahli, how do you think socialists and anti-imperialists should be responding to this conflict?
Yeah, so like in order to respond to this, I will start with what you first mentioned, that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is the second largest party in the parliament of Russia after the United Russia Party, of which Putin is a part. So although Putin had disparaged the USSR and communists and everyone, let's remember that it was the Communist Party of Russia, of the Russian Federation, which is the largest opposition to Putin also, was the one that had for the last 5-6 years been saying that the Minsk agreements are not working, that it like from the first day, the government in Ukraine, the post-coup government in Ukraine, and even Zelensky, who came with the promise of implementing those agreements and signed the second one. From the first day, none of them had abided by the clauses that were in that document, in those agreements. So it was the Communist Party of the Russian Federation that had been saying this from day one, that the Minsk agreements are not working, and that the peoples of Donetsk and Luhansk, the republics, not, and also the entirety of those regions, like the whole of Donbass, were getting butchered and will be like genocided. They were saying it even like just starting from after the coup, and they were the ones that had been like pushing for the recognition of these republics since all this time. So it was like a communist proposal that got the votes of Putin's party on February 24, sorry, on February 21st, when the declaration of the recognition was made. So although Putin was speaking disparagingly of Stalin or USSR, USSR no longer exists, and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union no longer exists, but uh, a sort of its inheritor is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and it was its proposal that finally Putin accepted. Well, I think he felt that it was a time, or that it would be a boost for his image, or whatever it might be. Or maybe it was actually not even that. It was that he just realized that the terror or whatever his nightmare was already happening. Like what the Communist Party had been saying for the last 4 or 5 years was already like a very big problem. So it had to take this thing. That is one thing. Secondly, I have been talking with this Russian Chavista, and he said that there is a drive towards a nationalization of strategic resources and strategic companies, especially the energy companies in Russia. Now, let's remember that it was first, you mentioned Yeltsin, so it was Gorbachev and then Yeltsin who had dismantled all these nationalized corporations, okay, and did something called liberalization, so that these national corporations were privatized, brought up by both homegrown and foreign multinationals. And if you look at the big energy companies at present, like both Gazprom and Rosneft, they are both majority state-owned, like 80% state-owned. It wasn't so after the time of Yeltsin. So Putin, despite not being a communist nor being a socialist, he took a nationalist position in order to consolidate the majority shares of the Russian state. So he has been like a statist in this regard. And these policies, like the policies of statism, quite align with the policies of 21st century socialism, if we look at it like that. So, and at present, like there was this declaration in order to, like just after the sanctions came, in order to stop the flight of capital and the flight of foreign corporations from Russia, there was this declaration that whichever corporation left without and leaving its dues back in Russia, their corporation, their properties will be nationalized, and from that workers will be paid, etc. So that is also a very socialist position to take. That has happened in Venezuela, for example. I'm saying that has happened in a larger scale in Cuba with the land rights and such. So I don't know about land right movements in Russia. Oh, they happened in times of Stalin, Lenin and Stalin, but I don't know about it at present. But I know about these things, that there is a move towards nationalization and greater socialization of strategic resources and strategic companies, not necessarily from a communist position nor from a socialist or even a social democratic position, but from a position of necessity. And like Rob and Victor both said, if this helps the socialist cause, then so be it. If Putin helps the socialist cause by this way, then so be it. We are fine with it. So I think that whatever he might have said, he is not exactly doing a decommunization or anything. I mean, he isn't banning the Communist Party. He isn't banning the Communist Workers' Party or the Socialist Party or anything in Russia. It was Ukraine and the government of Zelensky that banned those parties. Communists earlier, and the socialists, social democrats, and anti-imperialist, anti-NATO ones very recently. So let's look at it with not from the rhetorics, or not from what Putin said in order to warm up to nationalists or the Russian chauvinists. And let's remember, he too is a Russian chauvinist and an Europhile, but they're like he may talk about it in one way, whereas his policies, I mean, and I'm saying his policies, but I will say not just his. So the policies that his government is taking are different from that rhetoric. And there is a reason why. It is that the Russian state is not Putin. The Russian government is not Putin alone. It's not a one-man army or a one-man show. The Russian government is very big. It has, like, it may hate USSR. I mean, Putin may hate USSR, but it has all the, like, many of the characteristics remaining from the USSR bureaucracy and the USSR system of government. So a decision is not really taken directly by the president or only by the president. It is discussed in like in lots of bureaucratic circles as well as in political circles, and only then, like only after a lot of discussion, a decision is adopted or policy is adopted. So I mean, he may hate, Putin may hate USSR, or Putin may say that he hates them, or hates Stalin, or hates Lenin, or hates Khrushchev, or anyone. He might hate everybody. And I mean, I have no problem with what he hates or what he likes, but let's look at the policies and decide on our own. So that's what I would say.
It's an excellent point. I was a little surprised recently to read that Russia has approximately 40% of its GDP that comes from state-owned industries, which is, according to some estimates, is actually larger than China's. Either way, it's very close. And I think it's about double that of Venezuela, which many people consider wrongly to be a communist country. Let's call it a socialist country. In the US, for comparison, it's somewhere about 10 to 12%. Another thing that Putin has been credited with is vastly improving the healthcare system of Russia, which I believe spends in the last 15 years about 10 times more of state funding, increased funding to healthcare than it did prior to around 2005. Again, we're discussing socialists and anti-imperialists' response to the Ukraine conflict. Jesus, I know you have a lot to say on this topic. Putin spoke rather disparagingly of Lenin and Stalin in his February 21st speech, particularly. How are we to respond to this? Jesus, you are muted.
I had my answer prepared in order to make some sort of kind of a defense of Putin. But when I hear Victor comments, I really feel him, as Rob said, in terms of that I understand his point in terms of, I mean, come on, I mean, there's these trends in the left, especially in the north, of criticizing whatever escaped their handbook of Marxism or something, and they want to criticize everything because that's the only thing that they can do, because they don't actually do anything else. They don't actually do real actions to build a revolution, you know, or change the situation in the north. so in that's why I feel what Victor says, because it makes a lot of sense when this left criticize what Putin said. So it's important to analyze it in that sense, because you know, that is a reality. I mean, that reality is there, that we have that left in the north that is always trying to find some crack somewhere to try to dig in and, you know, create division and you know, and destroy things that are that shouldn't be destroyed. So in that sense, I want to move up with my answer, with what I had prepared. And basically what I did was to take part of Putin's speech. I mean, one of the things that Putin said is Stalin incorporated in the US and transferred to Ukraine some lands that previously belonged to Poland, Romania, and Hungary. In the process, he gave Poland part of the was traditional German land as compensation. And in 1954, Khrushchev took Crimea away from Russia for some reasons and also gave it to Ukraine those are Putin's words. That's part of his speech on February 21st. And then he keeps saying Lenin criticized this plan, which according to what I read, it's not like that. And he keeps going and said and suggested making concession to the nationalists whom he called independents at that time. Which, I mean, as far as I understand, as far as what I have read, Stalin wrote a great book about the national question. A lot of anti-Stalinists says that that book was not written by Stalin, but by Lenin in their criticism against Stalin, you know, trying to subtract some intellectual capacity on Stalin. They say that, and they keep saying that the one that really wrote that book was Lenin, which goes in contrary to whatever I just read that Putin say. The only thing that is a fact from that approach, national approach from Stalin towards the national question, is that they actually try to solve the complex national questions that were all over Europe at that time and all over Russia at that time, with a lot of concessions to nationalities within what then became, a few years later, became the Soviet Union. So it's true that especially Stalin and Lenin had an approach of very different from the racist approach in Western Europe and in the US, to give concessions and autonomy to the upcoming Soviet republics that didn't exist at that time, but because when they discussed those things, we're talking about the 1920s. And the Soviet Union, as we know it, as we knew it, with the republics, came to existence in 36 or 37. But they solve, or at least they try to solve the national question in a socialist way, in a way of, you know, giving autonomy to each countries. For example, Lusordo, which I just happened to finish reading a few weeks ago, criticized the approach of Stalin, saying that they gave a lot of concessions to the autonomy of the Soviet republics in the constitution of the 36, but they didn't, and but they didn't elaborate in the legal framework to get a real autonomy, which is a fact. I mean, they enshrine the rights of the republics to be independent and even to secession, I believe, but they didn't advance in the legal, you know, framework for that. And that's also like a fact, you know. I mean, they try to put everything there, but they make it harder to make it happen. You know what I mean? But that's part of the discussion. But anyway, going back to Putin comments, I believe that that he have this typical, so he takes part of this typical anti-Leninist, Stalinist criticism towards the national questions developed by Stalin and by Lenin. But I believe that is a wrong approach, and we need to understand the national question approach of Stalin and Lenin within the framework of the moment in which they were, you know, developed this, you know, approach. Also, Putin says Soviet Ukraine is the result of the Bolsheviks' policy and can be rightfully called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He was its creator and an architect. This is fully and comprehensively corroborated by archival documents, including Lenin's harsh instructions regarding Donbass, which was actually shoved into Ukraine. And today, the grateful progeny has overturned monuments to Lenin and Ukraine, and they call it decommunization. So I wanted to highlight that part of his speech, because that's when he talks about decommunization. and he basically, when you listen to his speech, not read it, but when you listen to his speech, you notice that he is not happy when he mentioned that they are throwing monuments of Lenin in Ukraine. And when he talked in the first moment about the communization, and he keeps going and he said, you want the communization? Very well. This suits us just fine. But why stop halfway? We are ready to show what real decommunization will mean for Ukraine. That's how he ended up the whole scene. And of course, that's maybe that might be part of the things that has been, raised by some people. And in this particular case, I believe that he was trying to be euphemistic about the use of the term decommunization, trying to, to respond to these acts that the Ukrainians were doing against, throwing monuments of Lenin in Ukraine. But anyway, I might be wrong, but because you can also feel in Lenin's speech that he is very critical of Lenin's approach toward the national question. So, I mean, it might be a lot of things. And as Sahili also mentioned, I mean, he also should be, trying to address and, get the support of other forces within Russia that might not be supporting him, because he was giving this speech before a military action, before, a military operation. So it's like one of those moment in history in which a head of state needs to have all the nation behind him to avoid, cracks in the whole initiative. So that's basically my approach. We have other things related to the imperialist stuff, but I believe that I want to leave it up to there because we are running out of time. But I want to go ahead. I can mention something later.
Okay. I'll stop you there because I mean we are about 2 hours and 15 minutes into this debate, so we're only about an hour and 15 minutes over what we had hoped. So we're doing great for time. Thanks everyone for keeping your answers so brief, and don't feel that you have to hold back. We had hoped that Khalil would still be with us at this time. But unfortunately, he appears to have left. If anyone else needs to go for any reason or to eat a meal or whatever, please just check out at any time. We're here at the last question, which is a question that for many is an important question. For others, it's not as important, and that question is Russia imperialist? For anti-imperialists and socialists, I suppose a lot of socialists believe that anti-imperialism is the highest stage of anti-capitalism, and that in order to defeat or resolve the primary contradiction, it is acceptable to form alliances with non-socialist partners. And we saw that in China with Mao Zedong's alliances with the Kuomintang. We saw that during World War II with the brief alliance between Stalin and Hitler, or with the alliance between USSR and the USA to defeat fascism, for example. So many have debated whether or not Russia is or isn't imperialist, while others have basically said that it doesn't really matter, or it's not the important question to ask. So please tell us what you think. Why is this question important, or is it important? Why does this matter? Is Russia imperialist? Shahili, your thoughts?
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, Steve, for giving me this very difficult question. But anyway, yes, I have seen this debate that the conflict in Ukraine is actually an inter-imperialist conflict like World War I, for example, where imperialist nations were trying to divide up the world resources among themselves, the people be damned. So this is an approach from many in the left that Russia is imperialist, US is imperialist, and the conflict in Ukraine is like a proxy war between two imperialist nations. So we should not support either. Of course, when they say we should support neither. They actually end up supporting Washington, but that's a different part of the question. Now, in order to decide whether Russia is imperialist or not, we need to go back to the someone who Putin criticized. It's a Lenin. So it was Lenin that wrote imperialism, the highest state of capitalism. Now, when people say, many people forget that there is the word capitalism in the heading of that pamphlet. So imperialism has to be, has to originate from capitalism. So now, of course, Russia is a capitalist state, but now let us look like what sort of capitalist it is and whether it is like big capitalist power or whether it's a victim of capitalism. Because imperialism is not just something that someone chooses, right? It's a system. It's a, even now, like when we, like most countries, almost no country is a colony in name. Even now, it's an imperialist world. It's a neo-imperialist, neo-colonialist world. So it's a worldwide system, and we, whether we like it or not, are all part of that system, either as a victimizer or as a victim. So what is the position of Russia? Now, in that pamphlet, what Lenin said, and I wrote down in order to be able to be brief and not talk too much, is that uh, for state to be imperialist, what needs to happen to the state of capitalism in that country is that first, the production of that country has to be monopolized by a few entities. Secondly, that the banking capital and the industrial capital should merge and give rise to finance capital, which now we see all over the world. And then that finance capital has to be exported. And finally, the finance capital and the state should merge in such a way that one cannot be separated from the other, and it will be the finance capital that will be the master of the state. So in this, I mean, I am not exactly quoting him, I am explaining in my way. But anyway, so these are the four qualities that that would make a capitalist nation imperialist according to Lenin. Now let us look if Russia has all these four qualities or any of them. So first of all, in case of, like, if we think about production and like capital, Russia is not really a country that gives rise to finance capital. It's the US. In the aftermath of the World War II, in the chaos and the devastation, it was the US that that was relatively untouched. Like its mainland was untouched. It was only a bit of land in the sea that was touched. So the US, which was mostly untouched by the devastation of the war, could take advantage of the situation so that all the international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, or the later Inter-American Development Bank and organizations like that, the US became the de facto, de jure, both type of controller in all these institutions. So at present, it's the US dollar that is the currency of international trade, and like almost all of international trade goes through this platform, which uses the US dollar. And this dollar is not really backed by any natural resource. Like dollar is not gold. Once upon a time, gold, silver, precious stones were the currency, let's say, if we can use modern language for Middle Ages, let's say. So those were natural resources. Now this dollar is not really backed by any natural resource. It just gets printed and then it is used as a currency all over the world. So the US produces the finance capital and also exports this by this IMF, this World Bank, this IGB, this other financial institutions in the form of loans, and then forces these countries that take the loans to do what they call structural adjustment, which is just they have to give up their own natural resources. So it is colonialism by other means, as I call it. And we have very recent case of Argentina that had to, like, that was forced into this $1 billion loan that I mean, its people should not be paying, but it would have to. And it has not really recovered from what happened in the 90s or what happened even in time of mockery. So it's just an example I'm giving from Latin America, but there will be many countries in all over the world. Like for example, India, where I am, is the largest debtor to the World Bank. So what happens is that one after the other, all the natural resources as well as the national corporations are being privatized and given up to the monopoly capitalist multinationals all over the world, most of which are based in the US, based in Canada, in Switzerland, in Sweden, in France, Germany, etc., in Spain. So it is like Russia has none of these qualities. Ruble is not the currency of world trade. It is not a producer of finance capital. It is like not really a big power in IMF. Like it is not in the top 3, like of all the world's top banks. Like none of the top 50 is Russian, I believe. So it's like Russia does not have the capitalist power that could make it an imperialist nation. It's a capitalist nation, yes. So is Argentina, so is India, so is Mexico, so is Syria. Like these countries have to be in, like even Venezuela has to live in a capitalist system. It could try to transition to socialist system or something mixed. Cuba might try it, Nicaragua might try it, many countries around the world might try to do it. China is doing it in its own way through a mixed system. It went into the capitalist system and is now trying to transition towards a socialist system. So all these countries, including Russia, like just like all these countries, Russia too, in my opinion, is a victim of capitalism. So as a victim, it cannot really be an imperialist.
Thank you, Shahili. We are asking ourselves the question, is Russia imperialist? Does this matter? Rob, what do you think?
I think that there's no way I can put it better than Sahili, but I'm gonna try. I agree with everything that was said so far. It's hard for me to, even at a rudimentary understanding of history, to look back hundreds of years back to even where all the colonial powers were amassing resources, and then in World War I, where America came out also unscathed, and then all these same countries, the colonial powers from before, fight amongst themselves, and again, America is unscathed, come out on top of the world economically and physically. And then to compare that to Russia, that is a consistently invaded country that had their socialist project destroyed in the 90s. Really, the Russian Federation is about my age. And for me to equate that with what all I just described in America, we could talk at length about Lenin. But even in the title, it says imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. It is capitalism developed to what he described a monopoly. And we see these processes historically, like these countries fighting over to develop that stage to gain the monopoly status, right? And here we are. America has gained the monopoly status. You can call Europe junior partners at this point, right? They seek the benefits of capitalism. But when someone says a monopoly, it means like one person is in charge. So it confuses me when I see other leftists here in the beast, in the United States, that they're like, no, America's imperialist, Russia's imperialist, China's imperialist, and then even more infantile elements go into like, this is imperialist, that's imperialist. I'm like, what does monopoly mean to you? It makes no sense that these countries are on the same board, right? So that's how I feel. In America, there's like an understanding that like racism, the institution of racism is a systemic kind of thing. Whether you have that inclination in you, depending on your place in the racial hierarchy, you may not be able to exercise that power. And that's how I kind of think about imperialism. Yeah, Russia's a capitalist economy, right? But they can't exercise the power of an imperialist because they got their economy wrecked like over and over again, and especially just had to start brand new 1990s. So that's how I feel.
Great, very important points. Before we get to your answer, Victor, just wanted to thank again, Victor, for joining us from anticonquista.com. We know you have a very busy schedule, and thanks for sticking around to answer this very important question. Is Russia imperialist? Does this matter?
Yeah, and no, thank you for having me. Is Russia imperialist? The short answer is no. Does it matter? I mean, everything matters. I'm gonna point to the book that's been mentioned here. I mean, I strongly suggest folks to read this book, Imperialism: The Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. You have to read this book to understand this question. If you don't read this book, then you're not going to fully understand the question. And because I'm hearing imperialism, as Rob mentioned, being thrown around often now, like it's like a new cool thing to do. It's just like, yeah, now this country is imperialist, this country is imperialist. The capitalist press is doing that. They're throwing the term around. But if you don't understand, if you can't define it, then you're not going to be able to understand what the word means, and you're gonna be very, very confused. So Hallie said a lot of things there. I'm not going to add too much to it because she's dead on. It's a global system. It's a gang. Let's look at it as a gang of thieves, of looters, of warmongers. Their base is in Washington, okay, and they have allies. And the reason this is very, I can prove it to you in just a few words, is how Russia is not imperialist, right? If Russia were imperialist, if it were part of this imperialist gang of thieves and looters, the U.S. media would have a completely different portrayal of what's happening, right? So understand, the American public needs to have your buy-in when they go and lie to you about Vietnam, or when they go and lie to you about Iraq, or when they go to lie to you now about the Russian special operation in Ukraine. They need to lie to you. The same way Colin Powell lied up there in the UN, and he had the whole little the optics of they have this and so on and so they have to lie to you. Russia is simply not part of the gang. They're not part of the crew, right? So Saheli spoke to that. It's a political global system. It's an economic global system. It's a military global system that Russia is not a part of. They're not welcome to the table. They're an adversary. They're not part of the gang. And so for folks to understand this question, then you need to understand what imperialism truly is. And if you have not read the book, Imperialism: The Highest Stage of Capitalism, then you're not going to be able to understand this question, and you're going to do what everybody else is doing, which is you're throwing the term around without correctly using it. You're not using it correctly, and you're just labeling something because you heard somebody else say it, or you're confused about the term. Russia does not meet the criteria. It just does. It does not. Period.
Thank you, Victor. We're going to close things off in terms of answering this question with Jesus. We could stick around a little bit and have some maybe responses to what others have said, and closing statements before we close this up. So, Jesus, is Russia imperialist? Does this matter?
Yes, Russia is not imperialist at all, and Sahili already mentioned the five conditions that Lenin defined when he created the concept, and that's why, as Victor said, it is very important to read the book about imperialism by B.I. Stalin. I mean, you need to read it to realize immediately that Russia do not comply with any of the conditions defined by Lenin when he created the concept of imperialism. So what are those conditions again? Just to rephrase them very fast. The concentration of production and capital is one. The merging of one capital with industrial capital is another one. The export of capital and distinguished, as distinguished from the export of commodities is the other one. The formation of international monopolies capitalist associations which share the world among themselves. That's the fourth one. And the fifth is the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers. I mean, Russia do not fit in any of those conditions. And I just want you to read this is one of the first articles, opinion articles that we posted in Orinoco Tribune. The name of the article is Russia Imperialist? And it was written by Stanfield Smith. We published it in Orinoco Tribune in December 22nd, 2018, just a few weeks after we start, posting after creating and founding Orinoco Tribune. So, I mean, if you want to get deep into that, you can watch that that article. And also recently, and this is something that Steve shared with us. In this document that we prepared for this activity, Ben Norton did a nice explanation also in YouTube in a webinar entitled "The Fog of War Over Ukraine." It's a webinar on March 6th. You can look at it on YouTube. So he also explained very well there why Russia cannot be called imperialist. But we keep listening to it. And I mean, a lot of people using the term everywhere, especially those guys that Victor mentioned, or I mentioned, I don't know who of us mentioned, in the North, those leftist guys in the North that they consider themselves pure, and that they talk about this inter-imperialist thing. I remember that in Instagram there's this group from England, from the UK that is supposedly Chavista, but are in a few days ago they wrote down something about Russia's imperialism, and I wrote back to them and I answered inter-imperialist. When they post the scene, I just make a comment like inter-imperialist and put a question sign, and the only answer that they were able to send me is like send me a reference to a link where someone explained what inter-imperialist is, because they believe that they are the owners of the knowledge and that no one knows what inter-imperialist means, and that my question was related for the ignorance of a third world guy that did not know exactly what it is, and they did not understood that what I was trying to let them know is that they were not pointing at the right direction, so I mean, what I'm trying to tell you is that I mean, you feel that arrogant, racist, leftist, Nordic approach towards socialism, Marxism, which I believe is part of the problem. It doesn't explain the whole problem, but I really believe that it's part of the problem. And that takes me also to this post by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And let me read it to you. They posted it yesterday in the morning in reference to the Mariupol liberation. And they wrote, "They stop hiding it. Today, the command of Russian looters, rapists, and murderers acknowledge that the goal of the second phase of the war is not victory over the mythical Nazis, but simply the occupation of eastern and southern Ukraine. Imperialism as it is." So that was written by the Nazis themselves. So, I mean, what I'm trying, and I read it just to let you know how, to see if one of those guys that talk about inter-imperialist, conflict, listen to us and realize that what they are doing is giving ammunition to these Nazis to keep distracting the attention from the real issues behind the Ukrainian conflict. So that's another, thing that I wanted to highlight in relation to the issue of the, is Russian imperialist or not? Again, I mean, I believe that what Sahili, what Victor, and what Rob already say is enough to explain and to understand that we are not in front of an imperialist Russia, disregarding that we are talking about a capitalist country, and disregarding that maybe Vladimir Putin is a chauvinist Russian, and that also that he might hate Lenin and Stalin. I don't care about that, but what I do care is that they do not fit into the concept of imperialism. And also, I wanted to mention something just to finish about the regime change in Russia, which is something that we haven't talked too much about, and which is the explanation of the other side of the story. You know what I mean? I mean, a lot of people say that the Russians just want to occupy Ukraine, and then maybe other countries because they are crazy and they are the new Nazis or something like that. But no one talks about what is already a very visible, very touchable, which is the fact that Washington and NATO has been talking about regime change. I mean, they want to get Putin out of Kremlin, and that will be the biggest achievement that they can reach in order to do the plan that Sahili mentioned, that a lot of people have been talking about, even Putin in his speeches, of dismembering Russia, because that will be the dream of the West. And that also connects us with the issue of racism. I mean, the racism against slaves, against the slave ethnic group in Eastern Europe, that always has been a target by the Nazis, by the white supremacists that we know exist not only in Ukraine or in Germany. I mean, they exist all over Europe. And of course they exist in the United States. And they will be like botando baba of joy. I don't know how to say that in English, but they will be like extremely happy because they have two slave countries. I mean, I'm talking about Russians
Hey,
and go ahead.
let me just interject, and just for anyone out there who's unclear, in English that's pronounced Slavs, and that's what Jesus is talking about, the Slavic people, Slavs.
Okay.
No problem.
Yes, Slavic, right? Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, I got it. I mean, basically that. I mean, they hate the Slavic people, and they should be like rejoining how do you say that in English? Rejoicing themselves, looking at two Slavic nations fighting among each other. So yes, I mean, that's another thing that no one talks too much about. But while reading Lo Zurdo in his book about the Black Legend about Stalin, he talked a lot about that. I mean, about how this racist supremacy culture is embedded in the US and the West European culture, and they always has been wanting to, and also the Nazis, of get rid of that culture. And that is happening right now. And of course, they might be very happy for this happening. So, just to finish, I wanted to mention something not directly connected to, again, to the imperialist issue, but also about the legal approach to the conflict. There has been some leftist writers that has been writing about the legality or illegality of the conflict in terms of international law. And I want to raise that because yesterday I had this nice interview to a Cuban writer that wrote a book called the Metamorphosis of Interventionism. Leila Carrillo is her name, and it came to my mind that in that book she develops a lot the concept of responsibility to protect, the R2P concept, as a tool for intervention. And when we analyze what is happening between Russia and Ukraine, Vladimir Putin might have a lot of reasons to use the concept of responsibility to protect in order to intervene in Ukraine, but he didn't do it. He used Article 51 of the UN Charter to get into the war. I mean, as the legal framework for the action. A lot of friends of us has been talking about the legality or the illegality of that term. I have tried to avoid that discussion because it's complicated. But what I wanted to highlight is that Article 51 talks about self-defense, basically. I mean, so in that, when you analyze Putin's speech, he talks about self-defense as the legal framework of the military operations against Ukraine. And he didn't choose R2P or humanitarian assistance or whatever other concepts has been developed by real imperialist countries in the West. And he has chosen the traditional United Nations chapter to explain the military operation. And I believe that also make a difference between, you know, the imperialist approach to the conflict, to war, and the Russian approach to this particular conflict with Ukraine. And that also is very aligned with the Cuban statement, the first statement supporting or in relation to the conflict of Ukraine. They say it's something like, we don't want war, but Russia have the right to defend itself. That's one of the best statements that I've read from Latin American countries in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, and that's it. I don't want to talk that much because I talked too much already.
Does anyone have anything they want to add in response to that or as a closing statement?
Well, not just with regards to what Jesus just said. Again, folks need to really pay attention and some of the stuff is just, it's literally just a quick Google search. Like, you don't have to, like, I know there's, you know, some people don't go in as far as depth into it, as, you know, far into the details as we do or whatever. But if you literally just Google NATO, you know, post World War II, Google things like, you know, promises made to Russia after 90. I mean, you could Google this stuff. And so, you know, Russia is literally, if you look at a map and you see how they're just surrounded, they just keep getting surrounded by NATO bases and by NATO, you know, this idea that Russia, again, this thing just happened out of nothing, or that Putin is absolutely that this thing just happened out of the nothing. No, there's a reason why these things happened, and we could debate why, you know, whether or not Putin made the right decision to do this. I mean, those things you could debate, but to say that there's not an existential threat to Russia coming from Washington and NATO, I mean, then you're just that's either you're lying or you're naive, or you don't know what you're talking about. So yeah, they invoke that. I mean, so as Jesus was saying that, what's the name of the art? It's Article 51, or you said
51, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, it's in the I think it's in the speech. You know, you can look it up. You know, whether, again, you could debate whether or not, you know, the legality, you can debate whether or not that was the right thing to do, you know, morally, ethically, whatever. You know, again, you go back to the Iraq war. It was a preemptive war. It's based on lies. So, you know, a conservative estimate of the casualties in Iraq, that we've read and seen is that half a million of innocent people. I mean, innocent men, women, and children in Iraq. That's a conservative estimate in Iraq. For what? for nothing, because Iraq did not pose an existential threat to the United States or anyone else. It was a sovereign nation. And the United States preemptively waged war against a sovereign nation that posed no threat to anyone and lied about it, and lied about the reasons why they went. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Shahili, it looks like you want to say something.
Okay, so firstly, I'll say that the conservative estimate of the number of casualties in Iraq is 1 million. It was like the cost of war project of Watson Brown University. You can look it up. It says that the conservative estimate of Iraq is dead. I'm not talking about other like those invaders, but just Iraqi people. Dead is more than 1 million, and yes, 500,000 of them would be children. So I mean, children nowhere pose threats to no one, and yet these people got indiscriminately killed in Iraq. There is like 60,000 dead in Afghanistan, and many more to come because of the
Let
season.
me interrupt you there for a second. The US used Article 51 to invade Iraq. Self-defense.
Yes,
Did
they
they?
did. Yes.
And based off of what? This
Lies.
imaginary threat that, I mean, what threat? I mean, we know now. What threat did that?
Weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, which we know was based on a lie.
Actually, Iraq once upon a time did have, I mean, Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction that were given to him by the US. You know, and biological weapons were, chemical weapons were used by Saddam's regime against Iran. And like more than 100,000 people in Iran still suffer from that effect, like those effects of the chemical war. And like they receive medical assistance and all that stuff from the government of Iran, which is the second most sanctioned country in the world at present. So let's remember that it was the US that once upon a time gave chemical weapons, which are weapons of mass destruction, to the government of Iraq. Those were used against the neighboring country, Iran, and like people are still suffering in that country. And then US used weapons of mass destruction, that is white phosphorus, in Iraq. And the people, like thousands of people of Iraq are still suffering from the effects of white phosphorus. And they use depleted uranium on the missile heads in Iraq. Like all these are, like when people talk about wars, I mean, I have seen like in recent days, after World War II, they just jump to the war in Ukraine and omit everything that happened in between. And they said that there is all these claims that Russia is going to use chemical weapons, Russia is going to use nuclear weapons, etc. Well, the US has used chemical weapons many times. It used them in Vietnam, it used them in Korea, it used them in Syria. It used them, actually it did a biological warfare against Cuba. It was revealed a lot later. So like the US has actually done these things. What, like it is projecting too much on everybody else. So like the US has used all these things. Even it has used nuclear weapons, like depleted uranium is like uranium-235. I'm sorry, I'm going into physics, I'm a student of physics, but anyway, it is that the uranium that is more radioactive. So it just means that it will affect people's health more than if you are having a normal uranium ore, which is also bad. But anyway, so it is a sort of nuclear weapon that was used in Iraq by the US. It has also used like the chemical attacks that took place in Syria. I'm not talking about the Doma one because it did not happen. It was a staged thing. But the others, like for example, the one in Ghouta that did happen, like there is every sort of evidence to indicate that it was not done like it. I mean, Assad's government, Assad's military, like the Syrian Arab Army, does not have those kind of that amounts of chlorine gas or anything, but those things were given to the moderate rebels by the US and NATO powers that invaded Syria. So it's like the US actually has done all these things. It is the only country that has used nuclear bombs on a civilian population twice in Japan. So like it is the only country that has used nuclear weapons. It has used biological weapons many times. It has used chemical weapons even more times, either itself or through its vessels, proxies, whatever you might call them. So when this country says that Russia is going to use them, we should take it with not with a grain of salt, but with a lump of salt, like big lumps of salt.
Just one last thing. You just made me think of something. The United States is always talking about international laws and rules and none of this shit applies. Pardon my French. None of this shit applies to the United States. Like, it doesn't apply to if Washington does it, it's okay because it's Washington. It's the gringos and they justify it somehow. Torture, chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, declaring wars on countries unnecessarily, overthrowing government. I mean, all the things that the United States goes and uses against, in terms of their propaganda and rhetoric against other countries, they're guilty of. There are no laws. It's a completely lawless empire that just knows no bounds. They do whatever and say whatever. And again, I'm happy that we do this work because it's, in whatever way we can contribute to let people know, like, none of this stuff is conspiracy. This is stuff that's on record. All the things that we talk about here are on record. Like, this is not stuff that you need to, pull out of something. It's on record. We have actual government records of this stuff. Yeah, I just needed to say that.
Victor and I have had a little ongoing debate about mainstream media, and you had asked me before, and in reality, over the last couple of weeks, I've been sort of scanning through transcripts of CNN broadcast shows, really through hundreds and hundreds, let's say, pages of transcripts and of discussion on Ukraine. And not once did I see a mention of the 2014 overthrow or coup of Yanukovych. Not once did I see a mention of the casualties in the conflict in Donbass since 2014, the 14,000 casualties. What I did see, and maybe Shahli, you can answer to this, and I'm sure someone else will have, maybe Jesus, in response to what you had mentioned about the racist implications of this war. What I did see mentioned by CNN over and over again was how Zelensky was like Winston Churchill, and they compared him to this great diplomat because of the speeches that Zelensky made. Winston Churchill, of course, I mean, it's really fitting that they compare him to one of the most blatant racist and white supremacists who used chemical warfare on the colonized people of the Middle East.
In India.
Shahli, maybe you would comment on that.
So, okay, like, my people were victims of a genocide carried out by Churchill. Like, when Churchill was the Prime Minister of UK, the people of Bengal faced this genocide during the World War II, like from 1943 to 1945. They did not keep accounts. Nobody kept account, but the conservative or not so conservative estimates would put that number of deaths to from 3 to 7 million, like something from 3 to 7 million. So, like, my people were victims of a genocide, and then also the division of my nation, like the partition of the nation of Bengal into two parts, giving away a part of it to Pakistan and making it East Pakistan. And then, well, since we are into this, I would like to invoke a bit of a racial memory and say that in 1970, when East Pakistan, with the people of, well, we are Bengali people anyway. So when the people of present Bangladesh declared independence and said that they would not want to remain with Pakistan, they seceded. Basically, India went there with its military to help the people of Bangladesh gain independence. So I while this conflict was just started in Ukraine, I heard my parents talk about this, and I think that they and many in Bengal are seeing a sort of parallel between the Russia going into the regions of Donbas, because the peoples of those regions, like the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, had asked for Russian help because they were getting killed. So I and many others are seeing a parallel between that and the fact that in 1970 India went into, which was still Pakistan and a sovereign state, in order to protect uh, parts of the population. So that's like, I don't know which they used article. Don't think there was a responsibility to protect the idea at that time. I don't know, of course, but uh, I don't know if India was called imperialist at that time. I don't think it was. So to call Russia imperialist because it is trying to protect Russian speakers and ethnic Russians from getting butchered in its neighboring country, and also to eliminate other threats, is like I don't see, even from that memory, I don't see any point to that. It would be like, I mean, it would be like, for example, the people of like Chicano power movement, when they say free Aslan, and see if they start really something like freeing Aslan from US, and they, well, maybe if they ask, I was discussing this with Ardamir and some other people, and they said that if they were to ask the Mexico to help them, would they be painted as Mexican separatists? Probably. So this is what the mainstream media is doing. Like they're calling Ukrainians Russian separatists. I don't know if they called the Bengalis Pakistani separatists or Indian separatists. So I don't know, whatever. So the fact that the rights of peoples, like the right of self-determination of peoples, also exist in the UN Charter, we also need to keep it in mind when we think about what the people of Donbass may want.
Okay,
just
Zeus,
wanna-
maybe you can give us some comments and wrap this up, because we've got to do a favor to our audience, I think, and close this up.
Yes, I just wanted to add that going back to what you just mentioned about reading CNN, I've been watching. I try to watch CNN, the U.S. version of CNN and Reuters, because that gives me a sense of where they are aiming at. Not because I really enjoy listening or watching them or reading them, but since Ukrainian war started, uh, the scene, the bias and the propaganda is, at least from my perspective, disgusting. And it's important to highlight that, because some people criticize websites like Orinoco Tribune because we try to present an alternative position. And for example, let me tell you something. I mean, our ranking, our Lexa ranking in the US since the conflict began, went from 70,000 to 300 or 400,000. So that's our ranking within the US. I mean, that means that less people were reading us. Of course, that was compensated by an increase of reading of clicks from Europe. But what I'm trying to tell you is that the propaganda have its effects. Recently, that has been changed, and we are in the US, I believe, right now around the ranking 190,000 or something like that. So it's getting better back again. But what I'm trying to tell you is that a lot of people fall into that propaganda, and they immediately, whenever they read something that is not following the narrative of CNN, Reuters, and mainstream media, they reject it. But I believe that people have been realizing that something is wrong in that mainstream propaganda. And I believe that that's what Steve was trying to let us know when he mentioned this transcript about CNN and how they portray Zelensky, and also how they present for example, the humanitarian corridors, which is something that is happening right now. And mainstream media keeps saying that the Russians are not the ones allowing humanitarian corridors, when we know that they are the ones that has been trying to open humanitarian corridors, and the Ukrainian Nazis are the ones that has been boycotting that, or has been putting mines for people not to get into those places in the cities that have been trying to implement that. But you don't hear those things in mainstream media. And that's part of the battle that I believe that we keep trying to do, to fight, because no one wants to pay attention to that. And anyway, we will try keep doing that, disregarding some people calling us biased or Russian. I was reading yesterday something from the Canary in the UK. There was an article criticizing us or putting us within the group of Orinoco Tribune, within the group of Russian nostalgics or something like that. I will share that article with you maybe later. But what I'm trying to let you know is that there's people that criticize the work that we do, but I believe that we need to keep doing it. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I love you, and sorry for being so lengthy.